to our July no due date virtual salon. We have been very privileged to read Matt Ridley's book, How Innovation Works, over the course of this past month. And I've loved engaging in conversation with all of you in the portal. Pete and I are here today with all of you, and we are super excited to welcome Matt Ridley to our conversation today. Thank you so much for joining us. And
thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to the event.
Lovely. Thank you. Well, with that, Pete, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you and Matt, and we'll get this thing started.
All right. Well, Matt, thank you so much for this book, but also for joining us and with our group here. I tell everyone that my favorite phrase that I read throughout the entire pandemic is that innovation is the child of freedom and the parent of prosperity. And I have probably quoted that more than I've quoted any other quote, since 2020, in getting that across to people. And I hope that as the conversation comes, we can even unpack that some more, because I think that's an amazing turn of phrase and an amazing summary of so much that's going on, and that the essential lesson of economics actually should be that point. Going all the way back to Adam Smith and an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. We're now in the 21st century and we're still struggling with that inquiry. It's one of the really amazing things. So I'm going to limit my questions because I'm sure that our group has a lot of questions for you, from this reading. So my first question to you is just that you make a distinction between invention and innovation that's at the core of sort of this, getting to this phrase, right? And so can you elaborate a little bit on that so we have good clarity of the difference between invention and innovation?
Yeah, I think this is fundamental to understanding what's going on now. It's slightly me who's imposing these definitions on these two words. Other people might use other ways of distinguishing them, but I felt that people were using the word innovation to confuse two things. One, the guy who comes up with a prototype idea, and two, the guy who makes it affordable, reliable, and available. And so if you take someone like Jeff Bezos, I don't think there's any way you should describe him as an inventor, but I think you can describe him as an innovator. He's someone who drove the rollout of e-commerce to us all when it was a new technology, and pioneered a lot of the ways in which it became affordable, reliable, and available to us. And the reason for making the distinction in my book was because I felt that the innovators were getting left out of the story and all the attention was on the inventors. It's not quite true. People do think about both. And sometimes people are both. Marconi is quite a good example of someone who did invent radio and did also basically turn it into a commercial reality. But often you kind of get the impression from books about innovation that what's important is the guy in the ivory tower who has the idea, whereas the hard work of muscling down and working out how to manufacture the product or deliver the service in a way that people can afford, in a way that people can rely on, is often a lot more hard work than coming up with the idea in the first place. And I think this is what Edison, who, by the way, is another good example of an innovator, but not really an inventor. He didn't most of the things that he gets credit for. He wasn't the first to invent, but he was very good at making them available. I think this is what he meant when he said invention is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration.
Yeah. So, I don't know if you've ever had a chance to talk to Vernon Smith about this, but one of the things that Vernon likes to stress in conversation is how science progresses, not necessarily because of the genius who comes up with the hypothesis, but because of the tinkerer who comes up with calibration techniques which previously didn't exist that then allow us to then replicate science and other things like that. And when you hear him talk about it, all of a sudden, it's like, wow, like it changes everything. So it's part of the reason why, you know, his own innovation of experimental economics was so important, because it changes the way we do that, but other ideas in history. And so that I think that your book lays this out tremendously, of how, you know, you turn that in. And one of the main ones is the discussion of replacement parts, basically, and the ability to turn like a innovation, an invention that is kind of like a show good, right? That's just on the shelf, and you know, but it's too costly to implement, to then be able, when it breaks down, to be able to have low cost ways to replace it. Now I can turn it into an engine of sort of economic activity. And can you give a couple more examples of that kind of necessary move where we had these, besides the steam engine, other ones? Yeah,
just going back to Vernon Smith's very nice point, the development of techniques often did lead to the development of sciences. So the telescope played a huge part in the Galilean revolution, and the invention of X-ray crystallography was what really made possible the discovery of molecular biology and DNA and genetics and so on. So he's absolutely right about that. But yeah, the role of tinkerers is so important. I think it's often, politicians often talk about innovation as something that starts with the idea or the inventor's dream, and that happens in science, and then it gets turned into a technology which then gets applied. That's the so-called linear model. And it does happen that way sometimes. But quite often it happens the other way around, that you start with a technology that just begins to work and nobody knows why or how, and you then look behind it and have to make groundbreaking scientific discoveries to explain it. Vaccines are a good example. Vaccines, I point out in the book that inoculation against smallpox began in the early 1700s in New England and in England, and then later in the 18th century with Jenner, you get vaccination for the first time. And then Pasteur. And so you've got 2 whole centuries when you're vaccinating people without the foggiest idea of how the immune system works. The steam engine, as you say, is another example of the science of thermodynamics comes out of steam engines rather than the other way around. And there's a lovely recent example. In the last 10 years, I think one of the most exciting innovations has been CRISPR gene editing, this ability to very precisely change the message inside genes. And the people who got the Nobel Prize for it, Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier, are academics. So you'd say, right, here's a practical technology invented in academia. But where did they actually get the idea from? They observed something going on in the yogurt industry, which was that, if you're making yogurt, you need to have healthy bacteria. Bacteria sometimes get sick. The reason they get sick is because they've been infected with viruses. Studying how bacteria resist viruses is therefore quite important to yogurt companies. In doing so, they picked up on some obscure research by a Spanish academic who'd said there's strange genes inside bacteria. They've got these extraordinary repetitive palindromes. We don't understand what they're for. And these guys figured out that they were basically libraries of viral genomes that the bacteria were using to identify their enemies, so that when their enemies came along, they could fight them. And because it's all about precise recognition of sequences, this turned out to be something you could turn into a tool and apply elsewhere. So actually, this one starts in industry and then goes to academia, where it gets turned into something that's applicable to humans. So that relationship between technology and science is much more complicated than we often think.
Yeah, I think that, just to invoke Vernon Smith again, one of the things he talks about is the role of tinkers in Scottish society when Adam Smith was writing, and how Adam Smith bumped into all of these tinkerers, and what a big influence that had on his own thinking about stuff. And you wonder about that, is that, are we too isolated in some sense in academia today to have this kind of interaction effect that we should be having, between the real world, let's say, and the ivory tower, and being able to hold our scientific feet to the fire. So Joel,
so feeding back innovations from the shop floor to management, or to research, is a really important part of innovation. And I talked to Bezos about this once, and he told me of an interesting thing that he did at Amazon, which was to have a sort of reverse veto system. If a junior employee on the ground floor comes up with a new idea for how to manage something, or how to organize something, or whatever, and he goes to his boss with it, and the boss talks to his immediate colleagues, and if those 5 colleagues say it's a terrible idea, but one of them says, I'm not sure it is a terrible idea, then Jeff Bezos, wants to hear about it. He wants to hear about minority opinions within his company as to what might work next. I thought that was quite a smart thought.
Yeah, one of the first books that we read this year was a book by Adam Grant that had to do with thinking. And part of the organization of that was discussing how you create creative organizations, right? And so how do you create the cultures within that? And I think that one of the things that's fascinating about your book, because again, at the very end of the book, you're also talking about how we might actually be in a period where we're kind of, making it too costly to engage in some of these activities that we used to do. But there's an earlier period in which it flourished, obviously, and did that. And, Joel Mulcure has tried to examine that, what is the cause of being able to take scientific knowledge and turn it into commercially useful knowledge, and, these kind of questions. And, I was just wondering, there's obviously this mix between the political, legal, and social cultural environment, values that are required to get permissionless innovation, as opposed to a society in which we're constantly being asked to have a precautionary principle. And, what's your sense of, in the modern world, where the headwinds and tailwinds are going on that? I mean, I know you've written about the way that we should be questioning and dealing with the issues of the virus in an open debate. It's not like you say that the answer is obviously this way or that way. It's that we should have been able to ask questions, and we were told we couldn't even ask questions about it, right? And so I'm wondering, do you see a kind of a pendulum swinging kind of idea, or is it more like that Adam Smith's notion that 100 impertinent obstructions that human folly puts in our way, we find ways around it always? Or, what are those political, legal, and cultural rules or whatever that actually allow us to have permissionless innovation?
Well, being in the continent of Europe makes me somewhat pessimistic about this question at the moment. Europe in general, and the countries of Europe in particular, have been much more interested in throwing roadblocks in the way of innovation than they have in encouraging it in recent decades. They have managed to keep an entire technology out of the continent for an entire generation. I'm talking about genetically modified crops. But they've also managed to prevent any giant digital company emerging of the kind that there are lots of in North America, and several in China. And if you look at how they did that, it's basically too much red tape, too many precautionary concerns, et cetera, et cetera. And in Europe at the moment, we're talking about AI mostly in terms of how do we stop it doing things, not in terms of how do we help it to do things. So I don't think we live in a golden age of innovation. I don't think things are speeding up. I don't think this is only Europe's problem. I see America becoming less friendly to innovation too. to some extent, the federal structure and other things makes it hard to stop it happening. Look at something like fracking. It basically does happen in the US. It gets away with it, as it were. But there's a lot of pressures from special interests, from if you just look at the turnover of firms and all this, the churn, the creative destruction, it's slowing down. A lot of it's coming from the vested interests of existing companies. The ability to lobby against upstart rivals is quite strong these days. Yeah. My favorite example of this comes from the 16th century, which is when coffee was an innovation and a very popular one. And it was banned in most European countries, one after another. And for hundreds of years, they kept trying to ban it, and they usually failed in the end. Well, they did fail. We all drink coffee these days. But they had two arguments. One, that it might be bad for your health. And lo and behold, the wine and beer industry hired medics to make this argument in pseudoscientific pamphlets. And the other reason for banning coffee was because people drank it in coffee houses. Coffee houses had conversations going on with them, quite animated conversations because of the coffee. And those conversations were sometimes about whether the king or the ruler was doing a good job. Right. And that can't be allowed. You're not allowed to say that. So basically people were spreading fake news, so it had to be banned. That's a ridiculous story. But are we really that different with some of the ways we talk about innovation these days?
I have to send you this paper. Maybe you already know it, but one of my professors in grad school wrote a paper on the origin of the FDA in the United States. And the origins are actually in the Whiskey Trust. And the main idea was they wanted to actually ban competitor to whiskey that was emerging up, and they got together and they wanted to have unadulterated whiskey, which was actually more, harmful to you than actually, the whiskey that they were then now distilling. And so it was the new whiskey that was challenging the old whiskey, which was more like poison. And the old Whiskey Trust got together and they bought off this scientist Wiley, who ended up by being a big part of the FDA. And they use the FDA to do this. And it's exactly like your coffee story, but just all about that. And it's actually a paper published in the Harvard Business Review.
Several US states managed to ban margarine for about 50 years because it was a competitor to butter.
Those stories in the book are priceless. They're just great because it's modern Ludditism, which is, of course, what's driving the AI stuff as well at the moment. And it drives me crazy. Anyway, we have some people that already want to jump in. I have an endless list of questions that I would love to ask you, but I want to get to, Victoria and Taylor and Alice, and let's get the conversation going. So go ahead, Victoria.
Hi, Matt. What a wonderful book. I really enjoyed it. I have a question about the other end instead of the restraining part of the market, but the motivational part of the market and your views on patents. And so, you describe when an invention is in play that there's a group of people working on these things. Edison wasn't the only person working on the light bulb. And it's almost like you're describing sort of a legionnaire, sort of a bunch of people, marching together towards an objective. And if they're a little bit, they can be replaced. If one falls away, they'll still keep going. But whoever places the flag on top of the mountain gets the credit, right? The story's told about them.
Right.
But and then a bit further on, you point out Paul Romer's contribution to the thought of invention and innovation, and his commentary that this is sort of has characteristics of public goods. Mm-hmm. But then you push back on Mariana Mazzucato. I don't know how to pronounce her name, but she's like, well, if these are public goods, why don't we develop them in the public sphere and get funding for them? And then you say, wait a minute, evidence is such that these things happen or seem to happen more readily amongst business people and businesses than in the public sphere. So I guess, a patent enables one of those legionnaires, right, to capture property rights on a portion of what's going on. And the motivation, of course, is to extract usually a nice sum of money for that. And not all of them want that. You described 2 women that work on, I think, whooping cough, that just live their whole lives perfectly happy without fame and fortune. But isn't the goal to get as big a Legionnaire going as possible, marching together? And so patents are just part of that. You need patents to capture the attention of people who are driven and respond well to money. So that's, I guess, my question.
Well, that's an argument, and as you know, I'm somewhat of a skeptic about whether it's correct with respect to patents. Just back to the Matsukatu point, she says basically that because these are public goods innovations, they should be done by the government, which can pick the winners. I just think that's impractical, and I think there's an alternative to say, look, the private sector can do them. And it can profit from innovating even while sharing innovations. And then along come the intellectual property people and say, yes, but only if you give someone a property right in what they invent. And clearly, intuitively, that sort of makes sense. You know, that if I come up with a brilliant drug tomorrow, I can't be ripped off the day after tomorrow by a copycat. But in practice, when you look around the world at the way the world works and what's going on, you find that there are industries that don't have much in the way of intellectual property in them, but seem to innovate just fine, like the software industry, for example, that nobody really bothers with patents much in that industry. So it's not clear that they do incentivize people. And in fact, if you look at the story of innovators, they quite often get so hung up on defending their patents that they stop innovating. They just become defensive people trying to milk their monopoly that they've got. This happened to the Wright brothers, which spent years in court trying to sue everybody who built an airplane. It happened to the inventor of the telegraph, Samuel Morse. He ruined the rest of his life furiously fighting everyone else who said, hang on a minute, I also invented some of this. And so I think there's a tendency for the patent system, and by the way, Nobel Prizes and things like that, to sort of single out one person and give them much too big a reward for what they've done. Now, you can make an argument in the drug discovery industry, for example, where the FDA might require you to spend £1 billion proving something is safe, that you should be allowed a monopoly after that, because if you spend £1 billion getting it to market, then it's a bit unfair if someone rips you off straight away. But in a lot of industries, I think intellectual property has gone too far. I think it lasts too long. I think it's too strong, and I think you see the evidence for that in the way the expiry of a patent leads to a burst of innovation. So, for example, some 3D printing patents expired recently, and there was a whole lot of innovation after that. So there's a tendency for patents to slow down innovation, in my view. Incidentally, the other form of intellectual property which I benefit from is copyright. My books are copyrighted. Under present UK law, which changed about 10 years ago, that copyright will last for 70 years after my death. Books I wrote 20 years ago will be copyrighted to me until, let's say I die let's say I die in 2030, they'll be copyrighted till the year 2100. That's bonkers. I mean, why on earth should my great-grandchildren make vast sums of money? No, sadly, it's not vast sums, small sums of money out of my books over the next, for so long as that. And does that incentivize me to write books? No. Not one bit. I mean, if my copyright lasted 10 years, I'd still write books. If it lasted 5 years, I'd probably still write books. If it lasted 1 week, I might think twice about it. But even then, I suspect there'd be ways in which I could profit from writing books. Why did the British government change the law to that, by the way, to match what the US government does on copyright? Because the Disney Corporation came along and lobbied it and said, the Mickey Mouse patent's about to run out. We can't have that. It's our main money spinner. We'd like it to last a bit longer, please. I don't think that's a very good reason. So as you can see, I'm something of a cynic about patents and copyright and intellectual property. But I wouldn't, of course, go cold turkey and throw it all out tomorrow. I just think we need to find ways of reforming it and making it more flexible.
I mean, the question of IP is actually a very big research question
Yes.
in economics and law and economics and stuff. Taylor?
Hi, Matt. Just a comment on your comments about patents. I was just reading something the other day. I can't remember where it was, about the pharmaceutical companies and how they kind of game the patent system. I mean, it's important, I guess. You create a new drug, you spend $1 billion doing it, you need to get some kind of protection from it. But I was reading that the pharma companies will file tens or even hundreds of patents around these drugs, and then they'll make slight modifications in the patent or in the drug, and then re-up the patents, and it gets to be just a pretty expensive game that the large pharma companies can play. So
correct, and you get these phrases like patent thickets and toll booths and so on. Yeah.
So anyway, that's just a comment. My question, Pete, you talked about kind of the political, legal, and social environments of innovation. I'm not an economist. I studied economics in college. I got an MBA in finance from Chicago. All that's a while ago. But I never learned about innovation when I was taking all these courses. I'm fairly educated. It's only been in the last few years, actually, and I'm not a young person, that I've been reading about innovation and paying attention to it. And I'm just thinking that we really don't do a very good job of teaching about it, at least, in school, whether that's economics education or just education in general. And I think from a social perspective, it would be kind of exciting if we taught kids about how innovation really happens and the facts that they could become innovators. They don't have to be scientists to do that. I think that could make a big difference.
I think that's a great point. And part of the motivation to write this book was to come at it almost like I'd arrived from Mars and said, here's this thing called innovation. What is it? And do we really understand it? Because I got the impression that it's a word that everybody uses, but nobody particularly has made it clear exactly what it is or knows why it happens when and where it does. And I think we want to be much more humble, much more honest about how little we understand innovation, rather than and so I started out saying, look, I don't understand innovation, so I want to write a book about it in the hope that by the end of it I will understand it. And I don't think I totally succeeded. I mean, I understand a lot more, but the book is partly me working out my thoughts about it and working out what I think as I go along. I love your point about teaching kids that anyone can be an innovator. One of the things I wanted to get through in the book is that innovators and inventors too are not gods. They aren't special people with special blood flowing in their veins called creative juices. And that's why I slightly shy away from this word creativity, because I think to most people it says, you're special, you're creative, I'm not. And I want to get across the point that really quite boring, ordinary people with not very good educations can contribute to innovation, because innovation is basically trial and error. It's basically not giving up, persistence, thinking outside the box. It's not rocket science, and quite a lot of the people. My favorite story here is, of course, the Wright brothers versus Samuel Langley. I mean, I criticized them for spending too much time in court a minute ago, but the story there, Samuel Langley, brilliant astrophysicist, head of the Smithsonian, incredibly well connected, gets huge grant from the US government to build the first airplane. It's a disaster. It flops into the water in the Potomac after 20 yards or 20 feet, I can't remember which, but and his reputation is damaged. What had he done wrong? Well, he'd worked in secret. He said, I'm so clever, there's no point in me talking to anyone else. Well, that doesn't work. 2 bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, without a degree between them, Interestingly, their sister had a college degree. They didn't. That's a curiosity, which I've always wanted to follow up. But, Orville and Wilbur Wright mended people's bicycles. But they knew that if they corresponded with people in Australia and Germany and Britain and France and Chicago and God knows where about flight, they would pick up tips that they could build on, and they could then do years of experiments with gliders. And at the end of that, they might then be in a position to try putting an engine on one of these gliders and see what happened. And so they're wonderfully ordinary.
Yeah. You are one of the great writers about, science and society. Thomas Sowell is another one of these great writers, and he also has, at the end of Knowledge and Decisions, he also has a fantastic passage which hits right on what you were just talking about. He says, freedom is not simply the right of intellectuals to circulate their merchandise. It is above all the right of ordinary people to find the elbow room for themselves and refuge from the rampaging presumptions of their betters. And this is this issue of the tinkerers are ordinary people doing extraordinary things if just given the freedom, as opposed to Mariana Mazzucato, who is saying only extraordinary people can do extraordinary things if we give them the power to do it. So that's why she wants to have it be centralized and the state pick the winners and all this like that.
You're right. It's the libertarian way of looking at this is extraordinarily democratic or even demotic. It's about people.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to say is this relates to cultural things. I think that we don't study jokes enough. Right. So we should study how people, tell jokes in their society. And I was a Sovietologist. That's how I started my career. And one of the Soviet jokes that they used to tell, actually in like Crocodile and other kind of magazines or whatever, went as follows: is that a genie appears to give 3 wishes, and turns to the Frenchman and says, "What wish do you want?" And the Frenchman says, "I would like to have a bountiful vineyard with many mistresses." Boom. The Frenchman has his vineyard. And then turns to the Englishman. The Englishman says, "I would love to have a cottage overlooking the North Sea." Boom. There you get it. And then turns to the Russian and says, "What would you like?" And the Russian scratches his beard and says, "My neighbor has a goat. I don't have a goat. Kill my neighbor's goat." And the question is like, which society is actually encouraging, entrepreneurship, giving it a go, and all these things like that. And that's independent even of the rules and structure around it. It's kind of the way people tell stories about themselves and everything like that. And one of the questions I think that related to when you were talking about Europe and also the US is that, our younger generation, Alice knows this better than anyone, but our younger generation has been told for a long time that their prospects for a future are limited, right? Within 10 years, the next aerosol can is going to light up the world or something like that. And they've been preached that for a long time in almost and so they don't see innovation as the solution to a very serious problem, right? And what are the impact of that is going to have on the cultural attitudes toward innovation? Is going to be, I think, quite fascinating for us to study, quite sad for us maybe to live through, but quite fascinating for us to study. So
I quite agree. I think we give young people a counsel of despair. And if you engage with particularly an extreme environmentalist and say, look, you must be so worried about the climate that you must be a big supporter of nuclear power and getting it cheaper and fusion and all this. Oh no, it would be dangerous if if I waved a magic wand tomorrow and provided abundant, cheap electricity to the world, you can bet your bottom dollar Greenpeace would picket my factory. They don't want to solve these problems; they want to wallow in them. I often think.
Well, I'm going to get to you in 1 second, Al. But just the other day in the Washington Post or the New York Times, I forget which one it was, they reported this latest paper that was just done by climate scientists. And it said the following thing that by the end of the 2050, right, 2050, we are going to have sea levels which will wipe out New York and all the rest of the stuff. But it also said that it could happen in 2025. So it had a 25-year prediction range, right? And they're saying scientists have a new prediction. That's like nonsense talk, right? I mean, you know, a prediction rate, you know, and so I'm reading it and I'm like, you know, we need to, the best thing we could do is teach our young people critical reasoning. Right? We should have them all go through a critical reasoning and learn logical fallacies and be able to sort out a lot of different things, because there are serious problems that we're facing, but our greatest response to those is innovation, right? This is like Julian Simon's main point that he tried to, you know, get across to us for his whole career and had such a difficult time. But anyway, Alice.
Wow. Thanks, Matt, for this book and all of your previous ones. To Pete's point, I will probably get the quote off a little bit, but I opened some of my presentations and a tagline I use in my classroom is, from you, the 21st century will be a great time to be alive, dare to be an optimist. And I don't remember whether you opened or closed The Rational Optimist with that, but for over 10 years, I've been saying that to students.
It's the last words of the book, yeah.
Yeah. I love the way you wrote this book through stories, and this helps a teacher teach it. The one I particularly took notes on, a topic I'm working on and teaching about, is food. Just a tremendous chapter of the story of food. So my question for you is a really overarching one. I thought that maybe there'd be a mention of it at the end, but recognizing that this book was published, what, 2 years ago now? AI has been around for a long time, but certainly the recent big news of it is very present in this current year. And so my question to you, the rational optimist, pointedly about AI, is where do you see the invention/innovation aspect, the tinkering part of AI in addressing our bigger challenges in this 21st century that's going to be great to be alive in, of which your prediction is sure turning out to be right so far?
Remember, the other thing I say is that there are no experts on the future, and I mock all those people who made stupid remarks about the future, like, you know, Paul Krugman saying that the internet's impact on the economy would be no greater than the fax machines by 2005. So anything I say about AI or what the world will look like in 2040, you should disbelieve, because I'm no better at anyone else than the future. I really do think in these multifactorial systems, you know, in these complex dynamic systems like the climate, the economy, the pandemic, whatever, people are no good at modeling the future. And they should learn a bit of humility about it, because you know, as Pete's example shows, you either end up with an enormous range of confidence intervals which tells you nothing, or you make a specific prediction which you just can't rely on because it's far too unlikely to happen. And so I don't know what AI is going to do, but I do reflect on the AIs we've already got, and I think we have got a lot. We tend to think we don't, but there's a problem that we redefine something as not AI as soon as it's practical and useful. So GPS, you know, the capacity of my car to tell me exactly when I'm going to arrive at my destination to within a minute, and indeed to tell me about traffic problems along the way, is pretty damned AI to me, you know. The ability of a car to automatically park itself, etc. We're getting creeping AIs all the time, you know, predictive text, etc., etc. And you know, to an extent, automation is part of the same story. And what I see happening in those technologies, and therefore what I think is going to happen in the next lot, including the large language models and AGI, artificial general intelligence, if that's what we get, is that it's wrong to think of it as replacing or displacing us in any sense. It nearly always comes in alongside us and augments what we do. So, you know, I think the self-driving car is probably a lot further off than some of the optimists a few years ago were saying. I think they've gone a bit quiet, actually. I mean, sure, in some conditions, etc., you can have a taxi that doesn't have a driver in already, but you know, on a winding country lane in the north of England where I live, you know, when it's raining in winter, I don't think that's coming anytime soon. But I think the car that really does brake automatically if I'm about to run into something is already to some extent here and will be better. The car that knows where it's going, the car that can find the lanes on the freeway, etc., that all sorts of assistive technologies are coming. And I think the same is going to happen in radiography, in medicine, in many other professions. And by the way, the large language models have just made it happen in writing, which is really worrying for me because I'm a writer and it's about to make writing. I mean, I've interacted with ChatGPT and I was deeply unimpressed with some of the answers it gave to some of the questions I asked, but I was very impressed by its grammar. It didn't make simple syntactical mistakes of the kind that your students probably make all the time. And that's kind of, you know, that's my USP. That you know, I was an editor for many years. You know, I knew how to make a sentence read better. Suddenly, a machine can do that. But isn't that wonderful for people who are needing to write copy, you know, to go on product leaflets or something? You know, we all know these appalling instructions you get with some machines which have been badly translated and that kind of thing. AI is going to help greatly with that, for example. So I think the way to think of it is as an assistive technology in all sorts of fields that is going to some extent, just make it that much easier to do many of the things we want to do. I mean, just, you know, just touching my credit card on a machine that automatically deducts from my bank. How is that not AI? You know, that's pretty smart.
Ben?
Hey, Matt, thank you for another wonderful book. Early in the book, the concept of entropy makes an appearance, and I'm a little puzzled at the connection between entropy and innovation. Could you explain how those two are connected again?
Yeah. Well, I'm very influenced here by my good friend John Constable, who's an extraordinary thinker and has been saying interesting things about this for a long time, and he helped. I showed him early drafts of the book, and he made some suggestions. And what he and I think is that the world is a chaotic, messy place. If you look around the room you're sitting in, there are a lot of non-random objects made from purer metals than you would find in nature, objects made from in shapes, you know, that looks like a piano behind you. You know, that's you can't make a piano by accident. Okay, it's a non-random thing. What we know about that is that you have to reverse entropy. You know, you have to make order out of chaos, and the way, given that you can't make net order out of chaos in the world, that's the second law of thermodynamics, basically, you have to expend energy in doing it. So innovation consists of making useful objects that are non-random, improbable, the word I like to use for this, and require energy to make them. And I think that's a really important insight to understanding what innovation is, because it's true of non-physical things too. So this conversation is a non-random, improbable thing, in that the noises that are coming out of my mouth right now are not random. They actually have a structure and meaning, and somewhere in the back of my skull there's glucose being consumed to generate the energy to produce non-random structures and remarks, as it were. This is important, partly because people don't get that abundant energy is one of the main fuels of the innovation boom of the last 200 years, that it wouldn't have happened if we hadn't had coal, oil, and gas available in huge quantities to restructure the world in useful ways that are useful to me as the producer, but also ways that are useful to you as the consumer of the object that I sell you or whatever. So the more, and at the same time, innovation requires a lot of trial and error. You can't do that unless there's plenty of energy around. You're in the process of doing trial and error. Error by definition is entropy, if you like. It's sort of chaos. You need to generate a lot of entropy to come up with something improbable and useful along the way. So I'm trying to fit innovation into the science of thermodynamics here.
Thank you. That helped a lot.
You see that as related to maybe a common thread throughout all of your writings is not just this issue of thermodynamics, but evolution theory. Like, you're an evolutionary theorist. I mean, obviously you wrote a book, Evolution of Everything, but even like the whole idea about how it is that you have ideas having sex is really about, you have variation, you have inheritability, right? And you have selection going on. And that's true not only in human life, but in our economic life and in all of this stuff, right?
Well, if there's one big theme that underlies all my thinking, it is that the great insight of natural selection, that you can create incredible complexity, order, and fit between form and function through a process that looks random but isn't, but starts with random variation and then selects it, applies just as directly to the human world as it does to the natural world, and that we are far too top down in our thinking about the human world. Who was it who said, I think it must have been I'm suddenly blanking on his name, the French economist who said, how does Paris get fed?
Bastiat.
Bastiat. Is it because there's a brilliant French lunch commissioner whose job it is to make sure that the right number of loaves of bread and the right number of avocados are available in the right parts of Paris at the right moments every day to ensure that everybody gets lunch? It's an incredible achievement. This guy is the most spectacular planner. Who is he? And of course, he doesn't exist. It's a bottom-up phenomenon. And it would be a disaster if he did exist.
Yeah. Ryan.
Yeah, that evolution theme actually ties a little bit into my question, which is about the evolution of human institutions. I'm interested in how bottom-up culture and top-down institutions both affect innovation. I don't think it's one or the other. You need both. Inventions and innovations can happen in a permissive culture from bottom up, but without the right institutions, those will just clamp them down and people won't benefit. And it's the other way around. You can have perfect free market institutions, but if the culture isn't compatible with it, if regular people don't value innovation and invention, it's not going to happen. My question to you is one of those more important than the other, culture or institutions, or are they both so entangled that maybe that's not the right question to ask?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I wouldn't pretend to have the final answer on it. My gut instinct, but I try not to think with my gut, I try to think with my head, but my instinct is that we are often lacking the bottom-up culture, and that I can't think of many examples of a a society where the bottom-up culture is all wrong, but there are some lovely market institutions in the society that will draw up the innovations and find them out and spread them around. It feels to me like if you change the culture, you will change the institutions too in a better way. And just to sort of give an example of that, Deng Xiaoping's reforms in China essentially are very bottom up. He goes around and says, okay, guys, in your commune, you can grow food any way you like, and you can sell it to whoever you like. It's no longer somebody telling you from above. But we're just going to let you do that. We're not going to set up a stock market or a food market or a distribution chain or anything like that. We're just going to allow you to do these experiments. And bang, within about 10 years, you've got a growing economy. You've got a fantastically productive agricultural sector to start with. You've got all the institutions. You've got people forming firms. You've got people forming stock markets and investment decisions and so on. And what you haven't got yet is a lot of top-down bureaucrats poking their nose into everything to try and demand that you fill out paperwork in triplicate and wait 3 months for a decision on everything you want to do. You've got rules, you've got laws, you've got forbiddings, you've got people saying you can't set up a rival to the Communist Party, for example. But below that, you haven't got all the petty bureaucracy that gets in the way of innovation. So you've changed the culture there in Deng Xiaoping's China with effects that just, you know, a culture that had been desperately badly destroyed for 30, 40 years by Maoism. You know, the Cultural Revolution, key is in the phrase, had crushed people with the most dreadful disincentives. And yet within 10 years, you've basically got a flourishing capitalist, if you want to call it that, or free enterprise culture developing. 20, 30 years later, Xi Jinping starts saying, oh, no, I rather like that top-down stuff. I want to start telling people what they can and can't do in every corner of the economy. Well, he's going to kill the goose that laid the golden eggs pretty quickly, in my view.
We're running down to our last few minutes, so I want Taylor and Victoria to both make their question, and then we'll give Matt a chance to respond to both of them.
Matt, in your chapter on innovation essentials, one of your sections is innovation prefers fragmented government. I think
sorry, prefers what government?
Fragmented governance.
Fragmented, yes, yeah.
And we talk about federalism here in the US. It seems like we're moving away from that right now. And if that has a couple of impacts. When we're centralizing decisions, we're centralizing regulations. And it also, I think, diminishes freedom. It also, the larger the government, the more possibility for cronyism and rent seeking and so forth. It seems to be that's the direction we're moving in. I guess the question is, how is it possible that we can reverse that? I mean, that's a huge question, I understand, but do you think it's possible we can reverse that?
Well, I was writing this book when Britain was debating leaving the European Union, and I voted to leave. Most of my friends didn't, but I thought that this wasn't any longer a free trade bloc. It was a protectionist organization with a very centralizing theme, and it was saying what a free trade bloc should do is say, look, if you in Britain want to get good at making this kind of widget and free up the regulations around it, and you in France don't, you want to make some other widget, then good luck to you, and just trade freely with each other and specialize, you know, get good at one thing and the other guy gets good at another. The European Union was all about harmonization, was all about saying the rules must be exactly the same in Warsaw as they are in London, as they are in Madrid. And everything must be done in exactly the same way. And that felt to me like an imperial system. And we know that empires are really bad at innovation. The Ottoman Empire, the Arab Empire, the Ming Empire in particular. You know, you've got this wonderfully inventive period in China under the Song dynasty, which is very fragmented. It's basically a kind of federal system. It's a decentralized, it's basically a set of city-states. And the Ming comes along, there's a Mongol interregnum in between, but the Ming come along and say, every merchant must tell the mandarins exactly what it's going to do on every day. Well, that's no way to run a business. Sorry, I took up too much time answering that question, and I know you wanted to let Victoria in, so I should shut up at this point.
Victoria.
My question is totally different. It's about the tinkering and the culture. And it seems like since the 60s, you know, society wants a single goal person. So like, if you want a good job, you're supposed to be a white collar worker, you're supposed to be an attorney. And just now we finally feel like that's reversing. And within our school systems, we're saying, no, plumbers are really paid well. You should reconsider some of the trades and some of these types of things. And so, you know, you can look at this across the board. I mean, feminism took a whole bunch of women's energy out of the market for a single goal and eliminated a lot of other views, for instance. And I'm just wondering if we've gotten to the point culturally where people can be on more than one team. You can be an environmentalist and still support nuclear energy. You know, it feels like we're there because the environmentalists are clashing with each other. So it's obvious there's more than one interest at stake. But this whole sort of decentralized, you know, many different objectives in play at the same time, and the opportunity costs of giving voice to too much of one issue while other issues get ignored, and then there's an eruption or a flare up because no one's been paying attention to that other issue. So that's just what I wanted to talk about.
I think that those are great points. Just one very quick thought based on that. It looks to me like people say, look, the having one job is drudgery. It's really depressing to have to do one thing, you know, 30 years being a chartered accountant or something. And yeah, sure. But the alternative is to do a little bit of everything badly for yourself. If you become very specialized at producing one thing, then you can be incredibly diverse at consuming other things. And so people only focus on their role as a producer and not as their role as a consumer. And for me, you know, writing a book is a pretty specialized thing, but it enables me, you know, to go to the movies, eat in restaurants, all these other things where I'm consuming the outputs of other people. And that feels to me a wonderful bargain. And it's, as you say, nice to think of oneself as lots of different people doing lots of different things.
I'm chuckling because one of my close colleagues, Rosalino Candela, loves to quote the economist Jack Hirschleifer, who always says that what you need to do is specialize in production and diversify in consumption.
Absolutely.
And his argument is that when graduate students screw up, it's because they diversify in production and specialize in consumption. And that leads to a disaster in their life. And he gets so mad at them. I want to thank you very much, Matt, for this, but I want to ask you one last question, which is just a book recommendation. Are you reading anything recently or in the midst of reading something that you would recommend to all of us that we must read?
Oh, it's a really good question, and I know I've got a good answer, but I'm suddenly blanking. You know, the way one does. I've just started reading a book. It came out quite a while ago, but it's called The Devil's Alliance. It's about the Soviet-Nazi pact.
Oh yeah,
and the incredible importance of that. And the reason I started reading it because I was in Latvia and went to an amazing museum about what happened to that country under the Soviets and the Nazis. So that's a very interesting political book. What else? Yeah, there's a book coming out. Oh no, it's not going to be out for a while. But Michael Muthu Krishna, who's an interesting thinker at the London School of the University College London. or is it London School of Economics? I think one or the other has got a book coming out, but I now can't even remember the title of it, so that's not much use. I've just read it this week to recommend it.
Yeah, well, we'll be looking forward to it, and I appreciate the whole issue with the pact there is actually a devil's alliance, and it actually is a very important part of history. So that is a great recommendation. But Matt, I can't thank you enough for taking time with us and for writing this book and for all your books that you write. We learned so much from them, and we're looking forward to learning much more from the ones that come out in the future. So thank you.
Well, I'm a fraud. I just pick the brains of people like you, Pete, and these lovely people on the call, and then sell them. It's outrageous.
Well, we
Not
appreciate
outrageous at
that.
all.
Thanks. All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, everyone. And Amy, I turn it back to you.
Thanks. I have nothing to add other than thank you again to Matt for joining us. What a wonderful conversation, and thanks to all of you. We're grateful that we have this opportunity to get together and read and converse. So thank you very much. As always, for our subscribers, all of the things that were in the chat throughout the conversation will be captured and put into the portal, so you can reference them and find them later. And Matt, if you come up with the name of that other book, we'll be happy to add that to the list as well. So thank you all very much, and have a great day.
All righty.